The MPTF Media Center presents the international premiere podcast of Mystery Theater Audibles, Blackfire, a science fiction fantasy novel written and narrated by Anthony Lawrence, directed and produced by Madeline Smith Lawrence, produced by Jennifer Clymer, sound engineered by Marcus Murrieta.
Chapter 48. The lights dimmed, and a figure appeared on the platform stage as if from nowhere. There wasn't any sign of wings and no backstage, so the figure just seemed to emerge from shadows. It was the figure of a moderate-sized man, dressed in a simple woolen robe with a rope belt and wooden beads for counting prayers. He was barefooted, and his head was partly shaven in the tonsure style of a medieval friar, which is exactly what he appeared to be. There was just a narrow strip of hair around his head in the typical symbolic renunciation of worldly fashion and esteem. There appeared a gentle humility in his body language, and his face was kind and slightly cherubic, with eyes that practically glowed with a fierce intelligence. He certainly didn't look or sound like any of the other richly adorned and costumed magicians Jordan had seen in Las Vegas. His voice was vibrant but mellifluous, and he spoke with a simple directness and a touch of wry humor. "Good evening," he said politely with a smile. "My first trick is to speak in German and allow you to understand me in English. Is it working?" He grinned, and the audience laughed and applauded. "My name is Albertus Magnus. I have been known as Albert the Great and Albert of Cologne, but those are just ridiculous and stupid titles that mean very little. I'm just a simple Dominican friar who has always dedicated my life to the ideals of poverty and service. I was born somewhere around 1193. You doubt that? Well, you can doubt that and everything else you see here. You can doubt my very existence right here in front of you. But that's the nature of illusion. It is a distortion of the senses, revealing how the brain normally organizes and interprets sensory stimulation. But just what is illusion and what is reality? Sometimes it can be quite difficult to determine." The gentle friar, known as Magnus, suddenly waved his hand in a gesture toward the stage near him, and a small fire appeared out of thin air. It was contained like a campfire and burned steadily right on the stage platform while the audience murmured in surprise and appreciation. "Dominicans work very hard at manual labor, just as we always have, and we spend a great deal of time around fires and smoke. The smoke permeates our clothes and acts as a natural deodorant, reducing the odors. Now, I mention this simply as a benefit to those of you sitting closest to me." He grinned, and the audience laughed, and then he waved his hand again, and the fire disappeared. There was a smattering of applause, though not from Jordan, who wasn't yet impressed, and her feelings of unease had not subsided, but were rather increasing. "Where was I?" The friar mused for a moment, then continued. "Oh yes, some illusions are based on general assumptions that the brain makes during perception." The friar opened his robe slightly, and several white doves magically flew out of the opening and began to flutter around and above his head. "Now, are these doves real, or are they an illusion?" He made a pass with his hands, and the doves instantly froze in midair, as if they were on digitized film and had been stopped in freeze frame. There were audible gasps from the audience as they stared at the doves frozen in space, their white wings outstretched and immobile. Albertus Magnus made another pass with his hands, and the doves instantly disappeared as if they had never existed. The audience burst into a more appreciative applause. The friar just smiled and waited for the sound to die down. Thank you, you're very kind, but it was merely a small trick to to illustrate that sometimes illusion and reality can be difficult to separate and discern. Now, from the dawn of time, people have been trying to make sense of this one basic principle. I have spent my entire life and achieved a small measure of fame for some comprehensive knowledge of and advocacy for the peaceful coexistence of science and religion. Oh, there's been much confusion and much conflict about both. I have been criticized by both secular society and by the church for my work as a natural philosopher and what some believe to be alchemy and magic. Oh, sometimes you just can't win. But history has been kind to me. Dante made his doctrine of free will the basis of his ethical system, and Mary Shelley, in her great work, Frankenstein, wrote that I served as an influence to a young Victor Frankenstein. I can't say I was too thrilled about that last one, but I do believe in de mineralibus, the power of stones, in that they have occult properties. Now, while I did not discover the philosopher's stone, I did witness the creation of gold by transmutation and have temporary possession of the most famous of all mythical gems, the enchanted Blackfire opal. Magnus now extended his hand out toward the audience and exposed the exquisite Blackfire opal which he had been holding clasped in his hand. It radiated its iridescent fire and floated from his hand and stopped in midair, frozen just like the doves. There were some gasps from the audience as they stared at the sparkling jewel suspended in midair next to the friar. "Isn't it beautiful?" "It is said to be enchanted." Magnus now made a slow pass with his hand over the floating gem, and it began to revolve in space, spinning faster and faster, and then transforming itself into a somewhat larger object that appeared to be the shape and size of a man's head. It was obscure at first, then slowly sharpened into focus and became the actual brazen head icon that was on the poster outside of the club. But it was now three-dimensional, a brass head that seemed to be both ancient yet very much like a futuristic mechanical automaton with black eyes and a movable mouth on a hinged jaw. It was poised in midair with no discernible strings or wires holding it suspended. The audience was murmuring, impressed and fascinated. Now, this is definitely not my colleague Morpheus, but it is the brass brazen head that I created many years ago with the help of the Blackfire opal. It is all-seeing and can answer questions that I cannot. It is here that I would like someone in the audience to join with me in a unique and rare experience and opportunity of asking the head any question you might wish answered. Somehow, Jordan knew instantly whom the friar was going to call on to come and join him. It was just one of those things that you knew before it happened, and you could never explain why or how. But Magnus was staring right at her and moving slowly toward her, smiling reassuringly. "I see a young lady there on the aisle, and I can deduce from her expression that she is both terrified at the prospect of coming over here and yet somehow needing to know the answers to questions that have eluded her for some time." Jordan felt herself shrinking down in her seat. Again, she wanted to just bolt and run, but she couldn't. She stared at Magnus with that terrified expression which he had seen and recognized. He came closer and held out his hand to her, smiling warmly. "It's perfectly safe, young lady. Nothing to worry about. I know there is at least one very important question that you must put to the brazen head while you have the opportunity. Come. Don't be afraid. Do I look like someone to inspire fear? Laughter, perhaps, but certainly not fear. Come. But Jordan could hardly contain her fear. She had died once, and Daniel had warned her that she needed to be careful. These feelings conflicted with her cynical nature, and she didn't know what to believe anymore. But she found her resistance to taking the friar's hand dissolving, and before she knew it, she was following him to the center of the stage, where she stared up at the brazen head with great apprehension and uncertainty. Magnus simply continued to smile reassuringly as he gestured for Jordan to address the head. "Go on, Jordan. Ask it the question that's on your mind." "How did you know my name?" "Oh, don't ask me. Ask him." "I don't think I'll bother with that. You probably know the name of everyone here." "Oh, as a matter of fact, I do." Jordan took a deep breath and looked up toward the brazen head, which floated without movement near and slightly above her. "Is my son alive?" There was a moment in which Jordan did not expect any reply. Then a voice issued from the head, a strange and somewhat metallic voice, and the mouth opened slightly. "Yes." Jordan was startled, but she quickly recovered and glanced sardonically at the friar. So you're a ventriloquist, too." "You know that isn't the case," he said simply. And Jordan knew that it wasn't what was happening. She didn't know why or how, but she knew she had to go on with questioning the head. "Where is my son?" "At number 18. "Number 18? You mean table 18? "No, the 18th hole." Jordan was confused and bewildered. "Are you talking about the golf course?" "Yes, that is where you will find your son." Jordan couldn't decide whether to laugh or cry. It was preposterous, the whole thing. She was standing here asking questions of some bizarre metal head that must be held up by invisible wires or something she couldn't detect. Cody was waiting for her on the golf course at the 18th hole. Everything just kept getting crazier and crazier. She felt herself on the edge, and she had to draw on all her resources to keep from freaking out. The friar put his arm around her gently. "Why don't you sit down?" he offered, gesturing to thin air. "Where? On the floor?" He passed his hand across a spot near her, and an ancient Roman lounge appeared instantly on the stage close to Jordan. She was stunned, even though she knew it had to be another trick of some kind. The audience was loving all of it and applauding excitedly. "Relax, Jordan. I think you need to relax for a moment." Jordan slowly responded to the friar's soothing voice by sitting down on the lounge. She wasn't sure what to expect next, but her will to fight against the strangeness of it all seemed to be wilting. Albertus Magnus just smiled in that engaging way he had, then raised his head to look up toward the huge domed ceiling above the stage. His hand came out to make a silent and grand gesture. There were audible gasps of stunned surprise from the audience. A large shadow flickered for a moment over the entire club, and then a figure formed out of nothingness high up in the dome of the ceiling. "Ladies and gentlemen," Magnus announced proudly, "may I present my colleague for your enjoyment and amazement, the son of Hypnos and Nyx, the primordial goddess of the night, Morpheus, the host of spirits and the shaper of dreams." The audience could hardly contain their gasps of sheer incredulity as a human figure emerged out of the shadows of the dome. Morpheus seemed to be in every way the embodiment of Michelangelo's statue of David, but this was not a figure of marble, but of pale living flesh, totally naked and exquisite of form and face. Outdoing the great sculptor's masterpiece, Morpheus was endowed with great undulating wings of soft white feathers that exuded from his back and shoulders, fluttering in a slow and steady motion that controlled and propelled the incredible figure through the air without any other apparent means of support. A Greek god appeared to be flying slowly down from the ceiling toward Jordan as she sat on the lounge. She just stared up at the figure, stunned and disbelieving. Her cynicism had disappeared in that moment. She was definitely impressed. She was more than impressed. She was awestruck and incredulous as she stared fixated at the naked, winged, godlike creature that was definitely soaring slowly down directly toward her. The forefinger of his right hand stretched out and pointed at her like God creating Adam as represented on the Sistine Chapel. She could barely hear Albertus Magnus as he continued to describe his colleague to the dumbstruck audience as they watched the fantastic creature descend. Morpheus, my friends, comes from the land of dreams, located somewhere in the underworld near the domain of Night and her children. There are 2 gates leading from the dream realm. One gate is fashioned of sawn ivory, the other of polished horn. False dreams pass through the gate of ivory, while truthful, prophetic dreams wing their way out through the gate of horn. The descent of Morpheus ended as he hovered near Jordan, the great wings slowly aviating him in a fixed position. His outstretched hand opened, and he laid the palm gently on her forehead. His own head descended slightly so that he seemed to be whispering into her ear, but his lips never moved. Jordan, however, could hear his soothing voice whispering clearly in her mind. When darkling wash of night at last explodes, and starry constellations silent shift, my gates of dreams divide the midnight roads through ivory and horn to magic drift. Jordan's eyes began to grow heavy, and she felt herself wandering as if through a silent and dark cloud forest, a pristine and Eden-like boreal garden. She could hear another voice in her mind as she appeared to float weightlessly. The voice was that of Albertus Magnus, but its tone was no longer that of a kindly old friar. It was as ominous as the forest around Jordan, and while she was growing steadily sleepier, she could not shake off the fearfulness that came with it. It is night in the serpent's garden, and venom is in the tail, sharp and corrosive as God's nail. Jordan began to see shadowy figures slipping through the dense foliage. You see the shape of wolves, as if you had no eyes. Now Jordan froze in terror as something large slithered from a tree and wrapped itself around her neck, something that was shutting off her breath. And you kiss the postman, Lord of the Dead. It was strangling her, and she could now see its coffin-shaped head and its massive black mouth, razor fangs, and its one single eye in the center of its head that flashed iridescent colors. Jordan was falling asleep, and she knew that she was about to die again. Chapter 49. What the fuck? Where was I? For an instant, I had no idea. My mind was a blank. Then it started coming back to me. I was talking to Oren. Holy shit, that was somewhere in 19th century London. That was it, a pub in Dickens' world. My God, was that real? Did I really see them? Did I really see and hear Pip and David and Nicholas and fucking Oliver Twist? No, it must have been a dream, just another nightmare, but it wasn't a nightmare. Somehow, deep down inside, I knew it wasn't. Wait a minute. How did I get there? Why was I there? I killed Bert. No, I couldn't do that. But I was there. I told him a bunch of crap and then I killed him. I fucking shot him in the goddamn chest. But I wanted to kill the priest and I couldn't do it. But I never wanted to kill Bert. And I did it. Maybe it didn't really happen. Maybe I just made it all up some way. Maybe Bert was still safe in his office back in Reno. But it wasn't a delusion. I knew it wasn't a delusion. I had killed him. Somehow they had overridden my free will, fucked with my mind. That had to be it. I felt sick. I wanted to puke. It was like I was having vertigo and the room was spinning around. Jesus Christ, make it stop. Then it did stop, suddenly. And I was there. No, I mean, I was in Jordan's suite. I had traveled through time and space in an instant, and I was back in Jordan's suite in the fucking resort. My mind was whirling around trying to figure it all out. How could that happen? Oren said something about free will, that I could just will it to happen, and it would. Something in the brain that was dormant, but I had the power to awaken it. So I just willed myself back. Was that what it was? Maybe I went there to kill Bert because they wanted me to. And maybe then my friends, the Dickens kids, came into my mind because I willed them there to comfort me, keep me from falling apart. Okay. That, at least, makes some kind of sense. But what about Jordan? Where was Jordan? Jordan. I had to save Jordan. That's what Oren had been telling me. What the fuck was he telling me? Something about a curse. Ondine's curse. You know what I mean? I had to be going nuts. What the fuck was that? Something about Jordan, that she couldn't breathe, that Daniel was changing the game against her in some way. Yeah, that was it. I had to pull myself together and save Jordan. I was in her suite, but where was she? Then I heard it. It was a muffled sound, like someone gagging, like someone struggling to breathe. The sound was coming from the bedroom. I grabbed my own arm and squeezed hard enough to feel the pain, just to be sure I was real myself. Then I turned and charged toward the bedroom. The door was open and I barreled into the huge room. There she was. She was in her bed, her face white and her mouth gaping open like a carp grabbing for bits of bread, gasping for breath, her body twisting in the silk sheets and satin duvet. She was unconscious and suffocating to death. I rushed to the bed and grabbed her, held her for a moment, trying to collect my thoughts, but I had very little time, as I could see her pale face was now turning slightly blue. I shook her and called her name. Jordan, wake up. Come on, wake up. I'm here, baby. You can do it. Come on, wake up. But it was no use. I could see she wasn't responding no matter how hard I shook or screamed at her. She was going to die or whatever else Daniel had in store for her if I couldn't figure out what to do. I mean, it wasn't like with a drowning person and you try to pump the water out or give the mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. Oren said I just had to wake her up to save her, and that fucking bastard knew everything, so that's what I had to do. There wasn't time to get help. I had to do this myself. I had to wake her up, and quick. Then I remembered that I had these night frights of my own when I was a kid, and they couldn't wake me up. They used to stick my hands in warm water, and that somehow did the trick. So I scooped Jordan up in my arms and headed for the bathroom. She was wearing a kind of filmy negligee, and she was like a rag doll in my arms, and I got her to the bathroom really quick. But there just wasn't enough fucking time for me to try and warm up the water in the sink. She was dying, for Christ's sake. She was dying in my arms. I had to act fast. The shower. I could put her in the shower. But I remember that night I first saw her when we'd broken into her place, how she went ape when that asshole we'd wasted in her apartment had her in the shower. She said later that it must have reminded her of when she tried to save her son in the water with the fucking jellyfish. It had made her hysterical, but maybe that same kind of shock just might wake her up. I had to give it a shot. There just wasn't any time to worry about anything else. I reached out with one hand and flipped on the three-way shower, and then I walked right in the cascade of water with Jordan in my arms. I sunk down with her into a corner of the shower, and we were crumpled there together in the heavy stream coming from the large shower head and the side spouts. A flume of water poured down on both of us, soaking us, streaming down onto her face as she gagged and fought for breath. I thought I was too late. I thought nothing could save her. She was blue-gray, and she looked as close to death as anyone could get. But as long as she was still moving, I felt somehow there was hope. Maybe now was the time for mouth-to-mouth. Maybe I could force air into her lungs. I leaned my head outside the streaming water, took a deep breath of air into my own lungs. Then I pried her jaw open with my fingers, pressed my mouth hard onto hers, and let go of my air directly into her mouth. I could see her cheeks puff out from the pressure, and some air was escaping, but I just kept on forcing the air into her. Each time I took a deep breath to gather more air, I screamed at her in bursts of angry insistence. Breathe, God damn it, Jordan, breathe. You're not gonna die on me. Come on, not now. No, breathe, you little shit. Come on, breathe. I was getting dizzy from over-breathing, but I just kept on forcing air into her lungs. Then I saw that something was happening. She choked and coughed and gasped and started to breathe. Slowly at first, but steadily sucking in air from my breath. then getting a little more air each time until she was starting to breathe on her own, and I knew it was okay that she was going to live, and I nearly broke down myself. I nearly cried because I knew right then that I was in love with her, and I don't think I could have survived if I had lost her. She was beginning to tremble from the cold. I shut off the water, lifted her from the shower. I was shaking myself, but I managed to strip the soaking negligee from her still limp body, grab a heavy bath towel from the rack, and began to dry the water from her. I gently dried and patted her naked body like a baby, then put a terry cloth robe on her as I saw she was beginning to come around. There was still the same look of terror on her face as she began to regain consciousness and to fight against me as I tried to warm her. But quickly, she became aware that it was me and began to calm down. Then as she looked around and realized where she was, she sank into my arms and began to sob, softly but intensely, as if trying to exorcise the nightmare that had consumed her. Babe, yeah, it's me, Jordan. It's me, baby. Everything's okay now. You just had a bad nightmare. No, it wasn't. It was so... Suddenly, Jordan looked at me as if seeing me for the first time. Her eyes were wide with confusion and surprise. Is it really you, Rafe? You got your memory back? Yeah. Everything's okay. I'm going to put you back in bed so you can rest. There isn't time to rest. We've got to go. Go where? Out to the golf course. To the 18th hole. What are you talking about? I carried her gently into the other room to the bed as she babbled on about what she had dreamed or what she thought had happened to her. It made about as much sense as anything else I'd experienced or anything that was happening here. But I could hardly completely dismiss it. After all, I was sure I had just recently traveled through time and space and shot my best friend and had been drinking with some boyhood pals that didn't even exist. How could I put down anything she was telling me? How could I refuse to take her out to the golf course in the middle of the night if she was so convinced that she might find Cody there? Was her story about magicians and Greek gods and a talking head that told her where she could find Cody any less credible? She told me the whole story as she was getting her clothes on. All I could do was listen, shake my head slowly, and accept it as just one more episode in the strange and unpredictable occurrences here in this fucking new Kafkaesque world in which we seem to be inexorably trapped. Yeah, I read Kafka in college. His stories were marked by a senseless, disorienting, and menacing complexity. They all had a kind of surreal distortion and a sense of impending danger. What else was new around here? But this wasn't a story. This was real, or at least I thought it was. And while Jordan had won her last bet, I didn't have the heart to tell her that remembering who I was wasn't the result of my winning 2 at table 18. While I had still gotten my memory back, I had lost everything else. Something deep inside was pulling on me. I seemed to remember Oren warning me that I was still under the influence of Daniel because of that last wager and was consigned to be a member of his security team. That had to be it. That was why I killed Bert. I worked for them now. They were trying to kill my free will. They would be fighting against it for as long as I was here in the resort, trying to continually claim me as one of their own. Oren had said that I must resist it with all my power, which he claimed was considerable. I wasn't sure just what he meant by that, why I would be any different than anybody else in that department. But Oren had been convinced somehow that my free will was unique in some way, and that I must use it as best I could until he appeared once again to tell me the specifics of what I would need to do to get away from here and to destroy the Blackfire Resort. Chapter 50. The music was ancient, and its composer was anonymous and lost in the archives of musical history. But its tone of drums and bell lyres were morbid and might have been an ode to pagan sacrifice. The thin ray of light pinpointed the ghastly staring eyes that had no eyelids or eyelashes. They were just 2 eyeballs with a fixed, gaping ogle into space. They appeared both dead and yet somehow still alive. As the ray of light widened, it revealed that the eyes were set in the dark and deep sockets of a startlingly deplorable face. The popping, unblinking eyes belonged to a totally scalped head that was attached to a completely skinned, preserved human corpse. It held a conductor's baton in one skinless hand and seemingly at first glance appeared posed in a fixed attitude and waving it at an invisible archaic orchestral group playing ancient instruments. But this was not the chemically processed and gruesome remains of a plasticized human being in an anatomical exhibit. Those displays in Las Vegas and elsewhere by a German anatomist, Günther von Hagen, showed actual human beings stripped of skin and fat and injected with plastic and then positioned into lifelike poses taxidermy style. This tall, lithe conductor's skin had been methodically ripped away, and there was a pinkish void where his viscera were supposed to be. Besides a few supporting segments of muscle, bone, and ligament, the man had been rendered into a web of white, spindly nerves. But he was not posed into the rigor mortis of death. He was a cadaver somehow imbued with some sort of life by an unknown power and had become a ghoulish, animated exemplar of the human nervous system, arms moving slowly in time with the ancient music, body swaying slightly in its tempo. The human body is a symphony, Daniel said inside his mind, and was heard by only the 12 VIP listeners, with millions of finely tuned instruments playing in perfect concert. He walked slowly between the therapy lounges where the 12 VIPs were being attended to by a number of staff physical therapists and chiropractors. The spa was elegant with mirrored walls, soaking pools, and jacuzzi baths, and equipped with high-tech fitness and rejuvenation equipment. The young man who had once been Miguel Perez was lying on one of the lounges, his coal-black eyes staring at the nearby dais where the macabre corpse conducted his eerie symphony. So were the eyes of all the others fastened on the conductor, their own eyes just as deep and black and fathomless, with tiny, almost indiscernible sparks of light. There were 6 males and 6 females, all of them totally naked and supine, as the staff applied the various Swedish massage and Ayurvedic therapies, exercising and fine-tuning their musculature structures. The VIPs had been bathed, massaged, and toned continuously in the last few hours, and as the therapies were concluding, they were being shown in-depth views of the intricately designed human bodies that they now possessed. Daniel was speaking to them about the most remarkable creature in the known existences, revealing its elegant design. His lips did not move, but he was communicating with the 12 by means of some telepathic dissemination. They were already familiar with numerous humanoid languages, but Daniel was transfusing information to them in a non-linear fashion that consisted of large portions, components, and fragments that ultimately provided a totality of thought and concept. The human body is one of the most fascinating of all machines. Despite the fact that it contains no metal or mechanical parts, the intricate systems that interact within the body you now control allow it to walk, talk, and think, making it one of the most amazing machines in existence. Several more animated human cadavers appeared on the dais. Some were complete corpses, while some were only partial specimens, displaying a wide variety of cuts, slices, angles of perception, and artful juxtaposition of parts of bodies. There were bodies split into 2 or 3 parts, bodies with only one eye and half a skull, bodies with inner organs removed, kept intact, or dangling next to the frame of the original body. But they were all in athletic or sexual positions and moving slowly as if in performance, giving the display a kind of bizarre organic theatricality. There was the body of a goalie in a diving movement, stretching out with one hand to block a soccer ball. Another was preparing to throw a discus like some athlete in the Olympics, and an archer was bowing to fire his arrow. There were couples locked in lurid and undulating coitus, looking very much as Shakespeare had described the sexual act, as the beast with two backs. But this is not, Daniel communicated sardonically to the VIPs, as the medieval Italian poet Dante created in his vivid portrait of some imaginative inferno, a macabre vision of twisted bodies divided and rent asunder as a manifestation in the flesh of the deforming consequences of sin. Here, it is simply necessary and important to see firsthand how the human bodily systems interact with one another, to keep them moving and breathing, and how to obtain the most exquisite experiential stimulation from various forms of physical activity, especially those demanding high levels of performance. This is what Blackfire is all about for human and non-human guests. Total experiential stimulation that lead both to reward and punishment. Now the VIPs were watching a sprinter on the dais, whose flayed muscles fly around him like slices of prosciutto as he runs in slow motion. Then another female sports figure appears, that of a ghastly golfer about to tee off, the back of the trunk dangling behind the body so that the back opens downward and the brain nearly straddles the floor. We'll now examine golf stroke mechanics Daniel proceeded to process through his mind. And we begin with the non-dominant side of the body facing the target. Chapter 51. Jordan was recovering slowly as we made our way through the dark. It was 3 a.m. in the morning, but that shouldn't have mattered in this place, in this casino that all day was bubbling with life and excitement. It still should have been filled with people gambling, having a good time. But Jordan told me that it was the same the night she had wandered downstairs. There had been no one in sight, and she had gone downstairs on a circular escalator that now seemed to have disappeared. Well, I'd never heard of anything like that, but neither had she. In fact, we had never imagined a place like this. How could anyone imagine it? People found it difficult to imagine Las Vegas until they got there and stood on the Strip and saw it for themselves. But this place was far beyond Vegas in every way. If there was any such place as hell, we had certainly found our way into it, and that was for sure. There wasn't a soul to be seen anywhere as we moved through the lobby and outside the main casino. We followed the digital signs and made our way past the fabulous architecture toward what looked like a billionaire's playground, the Blackfire golf course, which was of Gibraltar-esque size, and its entrance must have eclipsed all dramatic course top entry drives. I knew it was going to be quite a distance to the 18th hole, so we looked for golf carts and found some grouped like huge box-like bugs in silent rows at the beginning of the long, winding dirt entry drive. But no matter how hard I tried to get one started, it proved a futile quest. Not one would respond to my attempts, so we just started walking. We were wearing coats by now and should be warm enough out in the night. I still had my doubts that we would find the boy at the final hole, but Jordan was determined and certain, and there was no fucking way I'd let her go out there by herself. Despite her initial cynicism, something in what she had experienced had definitely convinced her she would find Cody where the brazen head had told her. Nothing could deter her from finding her boy. She had won her bet, avoided a second death experience, and Daniel had promised to return Cody to life. Now she felt she knew just where he was. The moon was a thin, melancholy light, low in the sky as we walked briskly along the entry drive into the course. Its wide fern, eucalyptus, and sycamore forest-fringed fairways had vast greens, enormous lake-water hazards, steep hollows, and gnarly roughs offered a preview of the immensity of the course and the surprising ravines, canyons, and rocky gorges to come. The walk was exceedingly difficult and hazardous because we had only the light of the moon and the terrain became increasingly more irregular and uncertain. We might have expected something spectacular, but I had golfed some pretty good courses, and this was an unbelievably designed set of world-class holes in succession that played within fingers of rock formations above something we could not have expected. Fairways falling off into a jagged gorge with what appeared to be the top of an escarpment and cliff on the edge of the world and a vast ocean bay hundreds of feet below. An ocean bay in the middle of the fucking desert in Las Vegas. But were we really where we thought we were? The questions seemed unanswerable. We only knew well by now that by coming to the Blackfire Resort and Casino, we had dropped into some kind of unpredictable and dangerous dark Disneyland for adults. No fucking theme park Imagineer could have conceived. We could only suppose that a sudden appearance by a child at the 18th hole on this particular course might not be that unexpected or unique after all. Out here on this exhausting-seeming trip to nowhere, we just kept walking alone, silent, and apprehensive, cutting across cart pathways from tees to fairways, through the dramatic marshlands and along cliff tops, ripples and waves of tree-lined doglegs and whole slopes, for what felt like forever. The moonlight cast tepid, surreal shadows over the undulating landscape, and it was darkly ominous beyond anything we might have thought possible. We had only covered the first 17 and were heading toward where we thought the final hole might be situated when we heard the sound. It was the crunch of wheels coming closer along a pathway toward us. Unsure of just who or what might be approaching, Jordan and I held hands and remained still and alert as we watched the small, boxy vehicle coming up a steep hill directly toward us. In the yellowish moonlight, we could make out one figure in the driver's seat, and as it came closer, I could feel Jordan's hand stiffen in mine. It was someone she recognized, possibly the last person on Earth she might have considered to be coming to greet us. Chapter 52. I didn't recognize the figure sitting in the golf cart, but Jordan certainly knew who it was. I could tell from the look on her face. She was stunned and obviously surprised. It wasn't someone she expected, and apparently not someone she wanted to see. "Who is it?" I asked as the cart drew closer. "Tommy," she whispered softly with disbelief. "Who's Tommy?" "My ex-boyfriend." We stood silently there in the dark on the green of the 18th hole as the cart moved up the pathway nearby. Tommy the Hammer Rohash got out of the cart, holding a driver in his hand as if he was going to tee off. But the expression on his face was not that of a man about to play golf. He was a man about to do battle. He moved up to us, the club clutched tightly in his hand. "Where is he, Jordan?" he asked her grimly. "Where is who? What are you doing here?" "I've come for my son, bitch. I want Cody." Jordan was shaken and incredulous. "What are you talking about? It's been over 9 years." "He's my son. Where the fuck is he?" His threatening move toward Jordan made me step quickly in front of her with my hand on the Glock 22 lying in its holster under my armpit. "Take it easy, man," I said as I confronted him. He looked at me like I was dog shit. "Who's this asshole?" he asked her without really caring. The club in his hand came up slowly, but I had the revolver out and in his face before he could take another step. "Drop it," I said. The gun surprised him, but he only lowered the club without dropping it. Jordan intervened at this moment. "How did you find me, Tommy?" she asked him with uncertainty and obvious alarm. "I've been searching for you for a long time. And you must have known that Cody was dead." "I know you tried to make me think he was." "I never cared what you thought. He was killed at the beach." "So what the fuck are you doing out here, playing golf in the middle of the night?" "Look, Tommy," I said, holding the Glock leveled right between his eyes. "What we're doing out here is our business. My name is Rafe Dillon, and I'm with Hotel Security. You have no claim on Jordan or her son." He snapped at that. "He is alive, just like she said." "Who said?" Jordan asked. "The concierge. She told me he would be out here at the 18th hole." "And you believed that?" Jordan asked him, trying to instill some doubt, though she knew it was useless. "I wasn't sure until I saw you." Jordan stayed resistant. "We don't know if it's true. We haven't seen him. Why do you suddenly care after all this time?" You walked out on me. I needed you, and you just fucking walked out and took my son with you. And the bitterness turned reflective. I went back into rehab after you left, got myself clean and straight, and started looking for you. I found out you had a boy, my boy. I had a right to him, so I kept searching for you. Ended up in Vegas playing the tournaments. I hit it big one night and won over $1 million. I was rich. If you didn't want me back, I could at least be a father, give my kid everything. Then I heard about Cody being killed, but I didn't believe it. I never believed it. I knew it was just you trying to keep me away from him. It's not true, Tommy, Jordan insisted. It really happened. But how did you know I was here? How did you get here? I was invited. They told me you were here. I only had one other question. You play table 18? His expression turned quizzical and suspicious. Not yet. They want me to. What's the big deal about table 18? Jordan and I glanced at each other, knowing what we were both thinking. Our lives had been and were continuing to be manipulated by some unknown force and for some as yet unknown reasons. But I wasn't about to put up with this drug addict coming out of Jordan's past to lay claim to her child. I wasn't sure yet that Cody was in fact alive, but there was no way Tommy Boy was going to intimidate Jordan even if he had fathered her child. Okay, Tommy, here's the deal, I said meaningfully as I kept the Glock in his face. You say you're clean. I say you're amped up on some kind of junk, crack, coke, whatever. I've seen it enough times to know. Here's what you're going to do. You're going to turn around, go back to the casino, and fucking leave Jordan alone. What are you going to do if I don't? Shoot me? I never bluff. Cody's my kid. We don't even know if he's alive. I can wait to find out. Not here. Tommy stared at my face and the barrel of the revolver for about 3 seconds, and then slowly turned and started to move away. But what happened next was just a blur of movement. It was like he just fucking didn't care if I wasted him. He whirled suddenly, and before I could get the shot off, he had smashed my hand with the driver, sending my Glock into the air and then skittering across the smooth green turf into the darkness. He tried to follow that up with a right cross, but even though my hand was killing me from the blow of that driver, I managed to hit him first. He went down hard on the green, his driver wrenched from his hand and arcing off into the lakewater hazard just below the green. I went after him, full body, slamming down on him and trying to subdue him as quickly as I could. We rolled together across the green, each trying to gain the upper hand, and I just managed to catch a glimpse of Jordan searching for my gun before we both plunged off the green and into the water hazard. It was cold, dark, and both Tommy and I struggled with each other as we came up out of the water, choking, gasping for air and some kind of foothold in the clutching mud of the murky bottom. Tommy was wiry and strong, managed to wrench himself out of my grasp and force my head under the water. My lungs felt tortured as I twisted and tried to pull away from him. I was off balance and couldn't pull myself out of his vice-like grip. I just could make out the lower half of his body underwater and close to me. I had no other choice, so I reached out and grabbed his crotch hard and could feel him tighten in pain, double up, and then arch backward. It was enough to allow me to pull away from him, come up out of the water and suck in some air. I could see Tommy still crumpled over in pain, but managing to scramble back out of the water and onto the green. I knew he was going to go after Jordan and my revolver, and I had to get there first. Soaking wet and cold, I went up onto the green like a man possessed. I ran and stumbled after Tommy and managed to tackle him just as he was grabbing Jordan, who was still on her hands and knees, searching around in the dark for my Glock 22. She found the gun just as I grabbed Tommy, whirled him around, and got in a hard right fist into his face, sending him flying backward. But his momentum had sent him directly into Jordan, and they both went tumbling into the shadows. As I regained my footing and started to go after Tommy once again, I was startled to see him now emerging from the shadow and holding the revolver, which he was leveling at me with deadly intent. Jordan appeared behind him, her face alarmed and desperate. "No, Tommy, no!" There was no doubt in my mind that Tommy was about to fucking blow me away. It was in his drug-crazed eyes, and I could see the tightening of his finger on the trigger. Then something happened that I will never forget. It began with just a kind of whooshing sound, as of something hurtling through the air. It lasted for just a second, and then something ripped out of the dark and hit Tommy in the head. But the velocity of the object was so powerful, It tore right through his skull, penetrating his head and tearing out of the other side. I had seen bullets go through a man's head before, but I had never seen an object make a tunnel this large and so clean that for a moment you could see moonlight right through the golf ball-sized hole in his head before he dropped to the turf with blood and brain matter gathering quickly and gushing from the massive rendering. And it was a golf ball. It was solid red with Tommy's gore, and its force was diminished by its impact and ruinous course through his skull, but it still bounced along on the turf and continued to roll, making a thin red line across the green, and then dropping into the 18th hole in an unholy eagle.